Hello, this is Kabir Bora, and I'll be teaching Marxian Economics. This will be the very first chapter of a Marxian Economics course. I'll expect students listening to this to know some basics of microeconomics and macroeconomics. And usually at the University of Utah, we teach this at senior level, so most students would also know intermediate microeconomics. So to understand Marxian economics, we first need to understand and define what a commodity is. So a commodity is any good or service that is produced for exchange rather than for use. So I will italicize two words here, use and exchange. Right? So these are very crucial to our understanding of a commodity. So if a good or service that is produced for your own personal consumption, then it becomes good produced for your use. So it won't be called a commodity. But instead, as we usually see in today's world, most of the goods and services that are produced with the intention of exchanging it in return for some money, or if you go back 100 years, perhaps what we call the barter system, they would be produced with the intention of exchanging it for something else, right? In lieu of another good. So it really matters whether it's the good or service is produced with the intention of sale or whether it's produced with the intention of your own personal consumption, right? So that is how we define a commodity in a Marxian sense. So let us look at some examples here to solidify this concept of a commodity. The first one is subsistence farming. So subsistence farming is basically farming where farmers or people produce crops, agricultural crops for their own consumption, and they don't usually go out to the market and sell that produce. So knowing that definition of a commodity, would you say that a subsistence farming is a form of a commodity? Well, the answer here is no, right? The answer here no, simply because it is produced for your own use and not for sale in the market. Second one is a haircut, right? So talk about a haircut. It's of course it's not a good as such. It's a service. So if it's a service and a haircut is usually a service that is provided to us by barbers and at a salon. So if you go to a barber and get your hair cut, will that service be a commodity or not? It will be a commodity because we are going to the barber, to a salon, and we are getting the haircut, and in lieu of that, the barber gets money from us, right? So again, that haircut that is produced by the barber is produced so as to for exchange and not for anything else. Like he does not cut his own hair. Instead, he goes to he does not cut his own hair. Instead, he's there at the salon cutting other people's hair, right? So that haircut becomes an example of a commodity. The last one, Apple phones produced in China, right? So this is an Apple phone that is produced by workers, let's say at a Foxconn company in China, and it's produced with the intention of sale out here in the United States, right? So can we call that a commodity? Yes, we can call that a commodity because that phone that is produced by the producer in China, a Chinese worker that produces that phone, is actually not sold, let's say, to him, or like he does not produce it for his own use, but that phone is produced and most of the phones will be exported to the United States for the customers or consumers here. So the consumers here in the United States have nothing to do with the production process in Foxconn, but the ones that produce it are not able to use it in China, right? So instead, the one that actually benefit out of this is actually the consumers. Who are the ultimate, like the eventual users of this product produced in China. So logically, we see that the product of labor takes the form of a commodity in a commodity producing society, right? So what does that mean? It says that everything that we see here, good or services, or good or service, is kind of like it takes labor behind it, like it takes labor for you to produce anything, whether it be a good or whether it be a service, right? Most of these examples that we saw, it's always labor behind the production of, like these examples that we saw, or it's always labor behind the production of anything we see in the world, right? But as we define, it has to be with the intention of selling it to someone, right? So only then it will take the form of commodity, right? So it becomes kind of a necessary condition if you think about it, right? So anything that is produced ought to have use value. So if you have ought to have some utility, some use, and if it has use, then it will be produced, and if it's produced, then it could either be a commodity or not commodity or non-commodity, right? So it will be a commodity if it's, again, you know, like if it's to be sold, and if it becomes a non-commodity if it's not to be sold. Now here we have something called a commodity producing society, right? So here we ask, like, now that we have defined commodity, so what can we do with this commodity, right? So what, look, now that we know the very basics of a commodity, or the very basics of Marxian economics, what can this be used to investigate, or what can this be used to analyze, right? So we mainly analyze in Marxian economics, we usually analyze commodity producing societies, right? So what does that mean to be a commodity producing society? What kind of a society are we really looking at? So the domain of investigation, as I said, for Marxian economics, is a commodity producing society. But let's look at some of the examples of societies. So the very first one is a hunter-gatherer society, right? Like the very first society recorded, where we have more communal forms of, it's more communal, like it's mainly a community or a tribe that live together, and every person has a task, and every person carries out their task. I go hunt, let's say, for example, I go hunt an elk or a deer. I bring it to the community. Someone does the cooking part, and someone like serves it to everyone in the community. So every person there has a task, right? So that is the very first form of society that we know of. It's a hunter-gatherer society, right? And the second one is a feudal society, where, you know, like it's the serfs that work for a lord, right? And these serfs will produce their goods, and in lieu of some like very minimal tribute to the lords, but at the same time most of the produce are kept with the serfs, or, you know, they're mainly subsistence farmers. And lastly, it's capitalism, right? Capitalism is where most of the goods are produced with the intention of sale in the market. So everything we do today is not for our own personal consumption as such. There is always some exchange involved in everything produced, right? So that is the kind of society we're going to be looking at in the Marxian world, and that is our domain of investigation, right? So the key part here is that exchange forms the very fundamental, like it's a very basic tenet of Marxian economics, right? So without exchange, we usually do not have any kind of analysis that can be extended out to the other societies. Though there are some, of course, some extensions made by Marxists, but by and large, I would say that capitalism is really the domain of investigation. Okay, so we are also talking about a commodity producing society, and that commodity producing society will be a capitalist society. So as we saw, commodity has two aspects, right? So the first one is usefulness, and the second one is exchangeability. We saw that usefulness, like, you know, for you to have exchangeability, there has to be some kind of use value involved in it, or some kind of usefulness, right? So this is become like this kind of, as I said, it becomes sort of a necessary condition for exchangeability. And here we'll use some terms that you'll see more as we in the other lectures also. The first one is use value, and this is very akin to what you may have learned in microeconomics called utility. in your intermediate microeconomics course. Utility would, like the pleasure or the satisfaction you derive out of consuming a good or service, right? So that is the utility that is what we call utility in economics, in conventional economics. So it's very similar. We have use value in Marxian economics, which is commodity, which is of use. Commodity is of use to someone, and if it's of use to someone, it has use values, right? Second one is exchange value, and necessary if labor product is to be a commodity, right? So what it means is that, again, a labor product, which is like any good or service that that utilizes labor, which is almost all the goods. So if there's labor product or there's output, for that to be a commodity, there has to be exchange, and this is something that we have been discussing for the last 5 minutes or so. So these two aspects are important, right? So we're just defining it formally, which is one is use value and the other one is exchange value. Now, here comes the more important part. Now, if there's exchange value, how do we know how much we exchange a good for how much, right? Or in other words, like if good A is $5, or I'm sorry, if good A is worth something, how much do we exchange that good for is the question, okay? So here are some examples, as like some hypothetical examples. One is one laptop for 10 phones, or 2 tomatoes for 1 pineapple, right? So what we are saying here is that if we exchange 1 laptop, we get 10 phones in return, right? So if this hypothetical example stands, let's say in today's world, then who decides, or what decides that the exchange between laptop and phone should be 1:10? Right? What about 1:2? What about 1:5? Why not 1:7? And why only 1:10? So there has to be some kind of a law, so to say, that determines this exchange ratio between these two goods, right? And we need to understand for that, there has to be something common between all these commodities, right? So the question is, what is the commonality between all these commodities? Only if there's something common between these goods, right, can we have some kind of an exchange ratio, right? So as as the saying says, as the saying goes, you cannot compare apples and pears. Well, you can compare apples and pears if and only if there's something really common between apples and pears, right? So the question here is, what is the commonality between apples and pears, or what is the commonality between all the commodities that we're seeing here? So the commonality is that all are products of labor power, right? So everything that has been produced has labor power in it, has some labor content in it, right? So if it wasn't for labor, these goods wouldn't be produced, is what we are saying, right? So before we actually start getting confused with like, well, what if production is totally automated? What if production is totally automated, there's no labor there? But here also there's this complication of what the automated machine or what that instrument is or what that device is. And this is a more evolved, a more complicated discussion, which we'll have a look at later. But let's assume just a world where we don't have any automation. And if we're talking about a world which has no automation, then there has to be labor power, right? And even in an automated world, I would just say that there is labor power even with automated machines and devices, but for that we need to have an understanding of what we call, what you also may know as capital, right? So how capital arises in our setting, this is something we'll cover later, but for now, let's go with this, where we say all products have labor power, all our products, all the commodities are products of labor power. Okay, so in a neoclassical world, like in intermediate micro, as you may have done utility functions and understood what utility is, we ask what is price there, right? So how is price derived in a neoclassical setting and how is price derived in a Marxian setting, right? So when we talk about price, mainly we are referring to the exchange ratios, and as we saw with the example of laptop or phone or pineapples or apples, we saw that there is a ratio, there's a constant ratio, right? And this constant ratio in a Marxian world is defined by the labor content, which can somewhat be objectively defined as the labor hours labor hours utilized in production of that good, right? Whereas in the neoclassical setting is more use value derived, which means that if some particular good has a very high use value, let's say, right, has a very high use value, then its price should be really, really high, right? So here's the main difference here between these two schools. One is that the use value derived price is usually more subjective in nature if you think about it. Like I can derive, let's say, and you might also know that there's a unit also for utility, which is utils. So I may derive 10 utils from the consumption of a phone, whereas someone working at a call center might derive 1,000 utils from the consumption of a phone. Right? So the utils actually differ from person to person, so it's a lot more subjective. Whereas in the case of Marxian economics, there's some somewhat objective in that aspect, because we can objectively calculate the number of hours utilized in the production of a phone or in the production of a laptop. Of course, there are some complications, and as we go further, we'll also introduce more and more complexities to this very simple understanding of our framework. But that is how we approach this course also, right? So we'll go from the very simple building blocks, and we keep building on, and then we introduce the whole more and more extensions to our framework, and make the framework more reflective of the real world. So in a Marxian setting, the labor content, because it's labor content, it's a more objective approach to price determination, whereas in a neoclassical setting, it's less objective, very subjective approach to price determination. So this is what I have for this course, for this chapter, Marx on labor theory of value. This is the very first chapter of Marxian economics. And as for the next class, we'll use these concepts, and then we'll see how this labor content or labor hours can be divided further, and then we look at some more like how these things can even be measured, or how labor hours is measured in Marxian economics. All right, thank you.